Welcome to Granddaddy Speaks. My name's Andy Beverly, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the origin of our branch of the Beverlys in America. And so those of you who are kin to us or married into the Beverlys might be interested in knowing about this branch, which is pretty numerous because my sisters and I have got lots of children and lots of grandchildren, so we're practically a group of our own big enough to make a state popular with people. In about the 11th century, and what exact time in the 11th century, I can't find a record, a group of people came from a town in England which is called Beverly and was a walled city, but it came from a name called Beaver, like the animal, a beaver that gnaws down trees. Beverly, which is the place where the beavers built their little houses, their little wooden houses in the water. And it got to be called Beverly over time. They came from Beverly in about the 11th century, and they came to Scotland because they were distillers, and the people who were taking over in England at that point of time wanted to own all the distilleries and didn't want to let anybody make a living distilling alcohol and making beer. And so the Beverlys came to Scotland, and they went up way up in the mountains, not the mountains, but the hills of Scotland, to a place that we now know as Aberfeldy. And these Beverlys prospered, and they married back and forth with some Scottish people and became really modestly well-to-do friends of the wealthiest Scots, and became sort of minor nobility, but not big shot nobility like dukes and kings and queens and stuff. Well, what happened was that there got to be a war between Scotland and England because an English king who had been a Scottish prince got his head cut off. And so what happened in the next few years was that England was ruled by a dictator, and the Scots were very unhappy about this. And so over in Europe, the son of the English king whose head got cut off had himself a son, and his son was named Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. And Bonnie Prince Charlie decided to come to England and have a war and see if he could get the throne back into the hands of his ancestors, his grandfather. So what happened then was that there was a terrible war, and the Scots did not win, and the Beverlys that we're kin to from the town Beverly in England, but we had come up to Aberfeldy in Scotland, we decided we better get out of there because the English were killing off all the Scots that had been in that war. And we came to France, but there were no jobs in France, so we came across the Pyrenees into Spain, and then from Spain, who didn't want a bunch of Scots there because Scots were difficult and might take over the country, they offered us jobs. They offered us jobs in America. And so some Beverly brothers, about 4 of them, came over to America. And they came to North Florida, and they were building castles and little way stations. All the way, they were building little places from one end of the Spanish rule over in Pensacola all the way across to the other side in St. Augustine, where the two big parts of the Spanish people in Florida had their big fortresses. One of these guys, as time went on, one of these Beverlys had married a Scottish girl and brought her with him, and she had a baby. And her baby was born perfectly healthy, but she got something that happened a lot in those days. She got an infection from having the baby and she died. And this guy had 2 or 3 children that he already had and a brand new baby, and he was in a big mess because there weren't any more European ladies around for him to get to come help him raise that baby. So he was living on the shore of a lake north of Tallahassee, which in Creek was known as I-Ammonia, many islands. And he went across the lake to another lake where a lot of Creek Indians lived, including at times the emperor of the Creek Indian Nation, Alexander McGillivray. And that's a good Scottish name. And so when he went across there and asked around, saying he needed to find a lady to take care of his brand new child, he had lost his wife and he was very sad and all that, but he had to do something. One of the chiefs came to him and said, a perfectly wonderful woman, husband has just died, and she is a really good person, and you could have a wonderful wife if you married her. And so he married this Creek Indian lady, who is our probably great grandmother, and she raised his baby and had several children. And our branch of the Beverlys that come from George Roscoe Beverly, my father, Judge George Roscoe Beverly, the great Supreme Court Justice of Georgia, Roscoe Luke's nephew, who studied under his great uncle there in the Supreme Court of Georgia to become a judge himself. Those of us were part of the children that were born of our Creek ladies. So the Beverlys in this branch of the Beverlys have some Creek Indian blood. And we are still proud of having a little bit of that, because the most European acting people that we found when we came to America, we Europeans, were the Creeks. They built houses, they had farms, they collected animals and tamed them and had them in their farms, on their farms. They were very much like Europeans, and they were pretty tame. They didn't want to have wars or fight anybody or anything unless somebody happened to do it. And there was a war between the Creek Indians and the Americans. What happened was that a guy who later became president, Andrew Jackson, came down out of Tennessee and wanted to murder the Creek Indians and give the land to people that were from Tennessee that was getting more population than it could stand. And so they had a big war in Alabama at Horseshoe Bend, and the Creeks got defeated and they disappeared. And the Creeks did something very unusual. They just disappeared into the population. They got to be part of America. They grew, and there are a lot of people that don't even know they got a drop of Creek blood that do, because the Creeks just disappeared into the population. They went to work, they got businesses, they just separated. They weren't a tribe anymore as such. And so a large number of Creek people lived across America. When I was a little boy, I knew any number of people that said that they were kin to us, not because of the Beverly side, but because of our great-grandmother's side. They also were in that Creek family, that she was. The the noble Wind Clan Creeks. So there's a story of the Beverlys, how we came. The two of the four Beverlys went to California. And those two that went to California tried to find gold, but they didn't. But you know what they did? They started gardening, and they started growing vegetables and fruits. And guess what? They made a lot of money because the coal miners weren't making any food. They had to have food. And so they made a lot of money, and eventually they sold their land outside just the edge of Los Angeles. And guess what the name of their land was? Beverly Hills. So much for my story for tonight. Thank you for listening.